Within months, Deadwood had transformed from empty wilderness into a seething mass of humanity. Saloons, gambling houses, and brothels lined the main street. The sound of gunfire was as common as the ringing of pickaxes on stone. Wild Bill Hickok had been murdered here just 2 years earlier, shot in the back while playing poker. His killer, Jack McCall, had walked free after a sham trial, only to be later recaptured and properly executed. But by 1878, even the rough justice that had claimed McCall seemed like a distant memory. The town was now controlled by a criminal syndicate that made the earlier lawlessness look tame by comparison. 5 men had emerged as the unofficial rulers of Deadwood's underworld, and their reign of terror was about to reach its deadly climax. These weren't petty thieves or common drunkards. These were organized criminals who had systematically taken control of every illegal enterprise in the Black Hills. They controlled the opium dens that had sprouted up to serve the growing Chinese population. They ran protection rackets that forced honest businessmen to pay tribute or face destruction. Most despicably, they had turned the town's desperate women into virtual slaves, forcing them into prostitution through debt bondage and threats of violence. The 5 men were known by names that struck fear throughout the territory. Black Jack Morrison controlled the gambling houses and had personally killed at least 7 men in rigged games. Tom, the Butcher Walsh, ran the most brutal brothel in town, where women who tried to escape were found floating in Deadwood Creek. Miguel Santos had cornered the opium trade and wasn't above poisoning competitors with his own product. Gentleman George Hartwell used his refined appearance to lure wealthy visitors into crooked business deals before robbing them blind. And leading them all was Samuel Iron Sam Briggs, a former cavalry sergeant who deserted with an entire payroll and used the money to buy his way to power. The corruption in 1878 Deadwood was so extensive that even the territorial authorities had given up trying to control it. But one person hadn't given up, and she was about to make her move. What made these 5 particularly dangerous wasn't just their individual crimes, but how they worked together. They had created a system where justice couldn't touch them. The town's sheriff was on their payroll. The territorial judge had been threatened into submission. Even the federal marshals sent from Yankton turned a blind eye after receiving their cut of the profits. By December 1878, their control was absolute. They had turned Deadwood into their personal kingdom, and anyone who challenged them simply disappeared. Local business owners lived in constant fear. The few honest lawmen who tried to intervene were either bought off, driven out, or found dead in the gulch. December 24, 1878. The frozen streets of Deadwood, Dakota Territory, echoed with more than Christmas carols that night. Martha Jane Canary, known to every soul in the Black Hills as Calamity Jane, stood in the bitter cold, her breath forming clouds as she watched 5 men swing from makeshift gallows. What brought this notorious frontierswoman to become judge, jury, and executioner on the holiest night of the year? Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because today we're diving deep into one of the most controversial and hidden chapters of the Old West, a story that's been buried by time but deserves to be told. The year 1878 had been brutal for Deadwood. The gold rush town that had exploded into existence just 2 years earlier was now facing its darkest winter yet. Disease, lawlessness, and corruption had turned the once promising settlement into a hellscape of vice and violence. But one woman, a woman who'd already become a legend in her own time, was about to take justice into her own hands. Martha Jane Canary was no ordinary frontierswoman. By 1878, she'd already earned a reputation as a scout, a nurse, a sharpshooter, and a woman who feared nothing and no one. Standing nearly 6 feet tall and capable of out-drinking, out-fighting, and out-shooting most men, Calamity Jane had become both the guardian angel and the avenging spirit of the Black Hills. But the events of Christmas Eve 1878 would cement her legend forever, and reveal a side of frontier justice that most historians have chosen to forget. To understand what happened that Christmas Eve, you must first understand what Deadwood had become by 1878. The town had been born in violence. Built in a gulch where prospectors had struck gold in 1875, drawing thousands of fortune seekers to land that legally belonged to the Lakota Nation. But they had made one critical miscalculation. In their arrogance, they had failed to account for Martha Jane Canary, Calamity Jane, a woman who answered to no authority but her own conscience and feared nothing but the suffering of innocence. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether Deadwood belonged to criminals or to the people who had come seeking honest opportunity in the Black Hills gold fields. The transformation of Calamity Jane from frontier character to avenging angel began with the smallpox epidemic that struck Deadwood in early 1878. While most residents fled the town or barricaded themselves in their homes, Jane walked directly into the infected districts, nursing victims with her own hands and risking her life daily to save others. For months, she moved through the pest houses and quarantine camps, spooning broth into the mouths of dying miners, washing fevered bodies, and holding the hands of men who called out for mothers they'd never see again. She slept in chairs next to sick beds, washed infected clothing in freezing creek water, and buried the dead when no one else would touch their bodies. But even as Jane fought to save lives, the 5 criminal leaders saw opportunity in the town's suffering. They hoarded medicine and sold it at inflated prices to desperate families. They foreclosed on the properties of dead miners, stealing claims that represented years of backbreaking work. Most cruelly, they recruited women made destitute by their husbands' deaths, forcing them into prostitution to feed their children. Jane witnessed it all. She saw Black Jack Morrison literally gambling for the belongings of dead men while their bodies were still warm. She watched Tom, the butcher Walsh, dragging a widow from her shack because she couldn't pay the inflated rent he'd imposed while her husband lay dying of smallpox. She knew Miguel Santos was selling watered-down laudanum to families trying to ease their loved ones' final moments. The breaking point came on December 15, 1878. A young woman named Sarah Mitchell, one of the few schoolteachers in Deadwood, had been caring for orphan children whose parents had died in the epidemic. Samuel Iron Sam Briggs decided the empty schoolhouse would make an ideal location for an expanded gambling operation. When Sarah refused to abandon the children, Briggs had his men burn the building down in the middle of the night. 3 children died in the fire. Sarah Mitchell barely escaped with her life, but not before suffering burns that would scar her permanently. The surviving orphans were left to freeze in the December cold. Jane found them the next morning, huddled together in an alley behind the burned schoolhouse. 2 more children, a boy of 8 and his 6-year-old sister, had died overnight from exposure. Jane wrapped their small bodies in her own coat and carried them to the cemetery herself. What happened next would transform not just Calamity Jane, but the entire future of Deadwood. Sometimes, when the law fails, ordinary people are forced to become extraordinary. Stay with us as we uncover the most controversial chapter in Jane's legendary life. As Jane dug graves for those children with her bare hands in the frozen ground, something fundamental changed in her soul. She had always been tough, always been willing to fight for what was right. But this was different. This was the moment when Martha Jane Canary decided that some sins were so great they could only be answered with blood. That night, she made a list. 5 names. 5 men who had turned human suffering into profit. 5 criminals who had made themselves rich while children froze to death in alleys. She tucked the list inside her coat, loaded her Colt .45, and began to plan. But Jane wasn't planning random violence or simple revenge. She was planning justice. Frontier justice delivered by someone who understood that sometimes the law must be enforced by those brave enough to act when the system fails completely. What happened next reveals the tactical brilliance that lay beneath Calamity Jane's wild reputation. Rather than confronting the 5 criminals directly, she began a systematic campaign of psychological warfare that would drive them toward a trap of her own design. It started with small things. Gentleman George Hartwell found his expensive suits shredded to ribbons every morning. Miguel Santos discovered his opium supplies contaminated with substances that caused violent sickness but no permanent harm, a taste of the poisoned medicine he'd been selling to desperate families. Tom, the butcher Walsh, woke up to find coffins outside his brothel, each marked with the name of a woman who died under his protection. Black Jack Morrison's rigged gambling equipment was destroyed nightly, replaced with honest cards and dice that bore the names of his victims burned into the wood. But the most unnerving attacks were reserved for Samuel Iron Sam Briggs. Each morning, he found a new photograph on his doorstep. Pictures of the children who died in the schoolhouse fire, their innocent faces staring up at him in accusation. The photographs were always accompanied by a single wildflower, the same type that grew on their small graves. The 5 men knew they were being hunted, but they couldn't identify their tormentor. Jane moved like a ghost through Deadwood's alleys, using her intimate knowledge of the town's layout and her reputation as a harmless drunk to deflect suspicion. When people saw her stumbling through the streets in the early morning hours, they assumed she was coming home from another night of carousing. They never suspected she was returning from missions of sabotage and intimidation. By December 20th, the 5 criminals were on edge. They'd hired additional bodyguards and were sleeping with loaded guns under their pillows. But Jane's psychological campaign was working exactly as intended. She wasn't trying to kill them yet. She was driving them toward panic, making them act rashly and reveal their true desperation. The trap was set when Jane began spreading rumors through the town saloons and gambling houses. She whispered that the territorial governor was finally sending federal marshals with warrants for all 5 men. She suggested that the Lakota warriors were planning a winter attack on the town. Most effectively, she planted the seed that one of the 5 was planning to betray the others to save his own skin. Jane's plan was diabolical in its simplicity. She understood that criminals who rule through fear become paralyzed when they themselves become afraid. But what she did next would shock even those who knew her best. By December 23rd, mutual suspicion had infected the criminal leadership like a disease. Iron Sam Briggs accused Black Jack Morrison of stealing from their shared profits. Morrison suspected Walsh of providing information to potential law enforcement. Santos was convinced that Gentleman George was planning to flee with their collective treasury. The psychological pressure Jane had created was tearing their alliance apart from within. These men, who had terrorized Deadwood through unity, were now seeing enemies in each other's faces. They scheduled a meeting for Christmas Eve to settle their differences once and for all. Exactly what Jane had been maneuvering them toward. But as they planned their Christmas Eve confrontation, none of the 5 realized they were walking directly into the web of the most dangerous woman in the Dakota Territory. Christmas Eve, 1878. The temperature had dropped to 20 degrees below zero, and most of Deadwood's residents were huddled around their fires, trying to find warmth and perhaps a moment of peace in the harsh frontier winter. But in the back room of the Bella Union Saloon, 5 of the most dangerous men in the territory were preparing for what they believed would be a final confrontation among themselves. Samuel Iron Sam Briggs had called the meeting ostensibly to divide up their profits from the year's criminal enterprises and to plan for 1879. In reality, each man came armed and expecting treachery from the others. The psychological warfare of the past week had done its work. Trust was gone, replaced by suspicion and fear. What none of them knew was that Calamity Jane had spent the entire day preparing the saloon for their arrival. Using her connections with bartenders and working girls throughout the town, she'd learned every detail of their planned meeting. More importantly, she'd gained access to the building hours before they arrived. Jane's preparation was meticulous. She'd positioned rope and lumber in the alley behind the saloon. She'd arranged for trusted allies, miners who'd lost friends to the criminals' activities, to block the building's exits at precisely the right moment. Most crucially, she'd loaded her weapons and steeled her mind for what she knew would be the bloodiest night of her life. As the 5 men gathered around their table, counting money and arguing over territories, Jane made her entrance. But she didn't burst through the door guns blazing like some dime novel hero. Instead, she simply walked in through the front entrance, as casual as if she were ordering a drink. "Evening, gentlemen," she said, her voice cutting through their heated conversation like a blade. "Mighty cold night for counting blood money." The 5 men froze. In their paranoid focus on each other, they'd forgotten about the external threat that had been stalking them. Now, Faced with Calamity Jane herself, they realized their fatal mistake. Iron Sam Briggs was the first to reach for his gun. He was also the first to die, Jane's Colt .45 putting a bullet through his heart before his weapon cleared its holster. Black Jack Morrison managed to draw his pistol but never got a chance to fire. Jane's second shot took him center mass, dropping him across the table full of money he'd stolen from dead men. What happened next became the stuff of legend throughout the American West. 3 men against 1 woman, in a room thick with gun smoke and the smell of death. The odds should have been impossible. Tom, the butcher, Walsh tried to use the overturned table as cover, but Jane had anticipated his move. She'd positioned herself to control the entire room, using the furniture and shadows to her advantage. Her third shot caught Walsh as he attempted to reach the back door, the bullet spinning him around and sending him crashing into the wall. Miguel Santos and Gentleman George Hartwell made a desperate attempt to coordinate their attack, rushing Jane from opposite sides simultaneously. But Jane had been in more gunfights than both men combined. She dropped to one knee, letting Santos's wild shots pass over her head, and put her fourth bullet through his chest. Her fifth and final shot caught Hartwell as he tried to leap over the bar to escape. He fell backward, his expensive coat spreading around him like wings as he crashed to the floor. 5 shots. 5 men. Less than 30 seconds from the time Jane spoke her first words to the moment the last criminal hit the floor. The room fell silent except for the ringing of gunshots and the sound of Jane's steady breathing as she surveyed her work. But Calamity Jane wasn't finished. What she did next would ensure that the people of Deadwood never forgot this Christmas Eve. In the eerie silence that followed the gunfight, Jane methodically checked each body to ensure the 5 criminals were dead. But rather than leaving them where they'd fallen or calling for the Undertaker, she set about implementing the final phase of her plan, a display of frontier justice that would send a message throughout the territory. Working with grim efficiency, Jane dragged each body into the alley behind the saloon. The sub-freezing temperature worked to her advantage, preserving the evidence of their crimes written in their own blood. But Jane wasn't interested in hiding what she'd done. Quite the opposite. She wanted everyone in Deadwood to see exactly what happened to those who preyed upon the innocent. Using the lumber and rope she'd prepared earlier, Jane constructed 5 makeshift gallows in the town's main square. The work took her nearly 3 hours in the bitter cold, but her determination never wavered. Each time her hands began to freeze, she warmed them over a small fire she'd built, then returned to her grisly construction project. As word spread through the town that something extraordinary was happening in the square, people began emerging from their homes despite the dangerous cold. What they found was a sight that would be burned into their memories forever. 5 fresh corpses hanging from crude but effective gallows, with a handwritten sign nailed to each. Samuel Briggs, murderer of children. Black Jack Morrison, thief of dead men's gold. Tom Walsh, enslaver of women. Miguel Santos, poisoner of the sick. George Hartwell, destroyer of families. But the most powerful message wasn't written on any sign. It was the sight of Calamity Jane herself, standing guard beside the gallows throughout the night despite the lethal cold, her rifle cradled in her arms and her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. She wasn't hiding from what she'd done. She was claiming responsibility for it. The image of those 5 bodies swaying in the winter wind, with Calamity Jane standing watch over them like an avenging angel, became one of the most iconic scenes in Old West history. But the story doesn't end there. Throughout that Christmas night, the people of Deadwood came to pay their respects, not to the dead criminals, but to the woman who'd finally given them justice. Miners who'd lost friends to the gang's violence stood silently in the snow, nodding their appreciation to Jane. Women who'd been terrorized by the criminals brought her hot coffee and warm blankets, tears freezing on their cheeks as they whispered their thanks. Sarah Mitchell, the schoolteacher who'd barely survived the fire that killed 3 children, made her way through the crowd despite her painful injuries. She pressed a small wooden cross into Jane's hands, a cross carved by one of the surviving orphans as a Christmas gift for the woman who'd become their protector. Even the town's legitimate authorities, those few who hadn't been corrupted by criminal influence, came to witness what Jane had done. Rather than arresting her, they officially recorded the events as justifiable homicide in defense of the community. The territorial governor himself would later declare that Jane's actions had restored law and order to a lawless territory. As dawn broke on Christmas Day 1878, the 5 criminals still swayed from their gallows, but Deadwood had been transformed. The reign of terror was over. Justice had been served by a woman who'd refused to accept that innocents must suffer while criminals prospered. The events of Christmas Eve 1878 marked a turning point not just for Deadwood, but for the entire American frontier. News of Calamity Jane's one-woman war against organized crime spread throughout the territories like wildfire, inspiring other communities to stand up against criminal corruption and giving hope to those who believed justice was impossible in the lawless West. But the impact went far beyond immediate law enforcement. Jane's actions demonstrated that even in the most desperate circumstances, individuals could make a difference. She'd proven that courage and determination could triumph over seemingly insurmountable odds, and that sometimes the law must be enforced by those brave enough to act when official authority fails. The 5 criminals Jane killed on Christmas Eve 1878 had accumulated enemies throughout the territory. Within days of their deaths, testimonies began pouring in from other towns where they'd committed crimes. Stolen property was returned to rightful owners. Women who'd been forced into prostitution found the courage to escape. Honest businesses that had paid protection money could finally operate freely. More importantly, the criminal organization that had controlled much of the Dakota Territory's illegal activity collapsed overnight. Without their leadership, the various gangs and corrupt officials who'd operated under their protection found themselves exposed and vulnerable. Many fled the territory entirely, while others were captured and prosecuted by legitimate authorities who finally had the backing they needed to enforce the law. Jane herself never expressed regret for what she'd done. When questioned by territorial investigators, she was characteristically direct. Those men chose to make war on innocents. I simply finished what they started. She maintained that she'd acted not as a vigilante, but as a citizen exercising her right to defend her community when official protection failed. The legal aftermath was surprisingly favorable to Jane. A territorial grand jury reviewed the evidence and concluded that her actions constituted justifiable homicide under the circumstances. The federal government, embarrassed by its failure to control criminal activity in the territories, quietly supported this conclusion rather than face questions about why they'd allowed such corruption to flourish. But perhaps the most significant impact of Christmas Eve 1878 was how it transformed Calamity Jane herself from a colorful frontier character into a genuine folk hero. The woman who'd once been known primarily for her drinking and cursing was now celebrated as a defender of justice and protector of the innocent. The story spread through newspapers, dime novels, and word-of-mouth accounts that grew more dramatic with each telling. Some versions portrayed Jane as a supernatural figure, immune to bullets and capable of defeating dozens of men single-handedly. Others focused on her role as a nurse and caregiver, emphasizing her compassionate nature alongside her deadly skills. But those who knew Jane personally understood that the real story was more powerful than any fictional embellishment. She was neither superhuman nor saintly. She was simply a woman who'd been pushed beyond her limits by witnessing suffering she couldn't tolerate. Her actions on Christmas Eve weren't the result of supernatural powers or perfect moral clarity, but of very human emotions: rage at injustice, love for the innocent, and determination to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. In the years following 1878, Jane continued her frontier life, but she was forever changed by what she'd done. The woman who'd once been content to drift from town to town now felt a responsibility to use her reputation and skills to help others. She became a sought-after mediator in disputes, a protector of vulnerable communities, and a symbol of hope for those facing seemingly impossible odds. While Calamity Jane became a hero to many, her actions on Christmas Eve 1878 also came with a heavy personal cost. The psychological weight of killing 5 men, even criminals who deserved death, marked her permanently. Friends noticed that Jane drank more heavily after 1878, and that she sometimes woke screaming from nightmares about the gunfight in the Bella Union Saloon. The legend of Christmas Eve 1878 also made Jane a target for revenge. Relatives of the dead criminals, corrupt officials who'd lost their source of illegal income, and other criminal elements throughout the territory all viewed her as a threat to be eliminated. For the rest of her life, Jane lived with the knowledge that men with guns were looking for her, seeking to settle scores for what she'd done in Deadwood. But perhaps most significantly, the events of 1878 trapped Jane within her own legend. She'd become Calamity Jane, the Angel of Vengeance, a mythical figure who was expected to solve problems through violence and dramatic action. The complex, compassionate woman who'd nursed smallpox victims and cared for orphan children was often overshadowed by the gunslinging persona that emerged from that Christmas Eve. Jane herself struggled with this transformation. In her later years, she often spoke about the burden of being remembered primarily for killing, even when that killing had been necessary and justified. She'd wanted to save lives and protect innocents, goals she'd accomplished, but the method had made her infamous as well as famous. The Christmas Eve hangings also established a dangerous precedent that troubled Jane in her quieter moments. Throughout the territories, other individuals began taking the law into their own hands, claiming to follow Calamity Jane's example. Some of these vigilante actions were justified, but others resulted in the deaths of innocent people falsely accused of crimes. Jane found herself inadvertently responsible for inspiring both justice and injustice. The moral complexity of Jane's actions reflects the broader challenges of frontier justice. In a time and place where official law enforcement was often corrupt or non-existent, individuals had to make impossible choices about right and wrong, justice and revenge. Despite these personal costs, historical evidence suggests that Jane never regretted her decision to confront the 5 criminals. In interviews given later in her life, she consistently maintained that she'd had no choice, that allowing such men to continue terrorizing innocents would have been a greater sin than killing them. She pointed to the improved conditions in Deadwood after 1878, the lives saved by ending criminal control of medicine and food supplies, and the women freed from forced prostitution as justification for her actions. Jane also took pride in the fact that her methods had been precise and proportional. She hadn't killed indiscriminately or harmed anyone who wasn't directly involved in the criminal organization. Her 5 shots had claimed 5 lives, exactly the number necessary to eliminate the threat, with no innocent casualties or collateral damage. The woman who'd emerged from the smallpox epidemic of 1878 as a recognized angel of mercy had been transformed by necessity into an angel of vengeance. But both roles sprang from the same source: an uncompromising commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, regardless of the personal cost. This duality, the caregiver and the killer, the saint and the sinner, became the defining characteristic of Calamity Jane's legend and the source of her enduring fascination for subsequent generations. Christmas Eve 1878 stands as one of the most controversial and significant events in the history of the American frontier. In the space of a single night, one woman's actions eliminated a criminal organization, restored justice to a lawless town, and created a legend that would inspire stories for generations to come. But the true significance of what Calamity Jane accomplished goes beyond the dramatic details of gunfights and hangings. Her actions represented a fundamental principle that resonated throughout frontier society. When official authority fails to protect the innocent, individuals have not just the right but the responsibility to act in defense of their community. The 5 criminals who died that Christmas Eve had made themselves rich by exploiting human suffering. They'd turned disease into profit, desperation into opportunity, and lawlessness into personal advantage. In a frontier society where survival often depended on mutual aid and community cooperation, such predatory behavior was seen as a fundamental threat to civilization itself. Jane's response was both ancient and revolutionary. Ancient because it echoed the biblical concept of righteous vengeance against those who prey upon innocents. Revolutionary because it demonstrated that women could be just as effective as men in enforcing justice through force when necessary. The Christmas Eve hangings also marked a turning point in how frontier communities dealt with organized crime. Rather than accepting criminal control as inevitable, Towns throughout the territories began organizing citizen committees to resist corruption and protect their residents. Jane's example showed that even the most powerful criminal organizations could be defeated by determined individuals willing to risk everything for justice. The story of Calamity Jane's Christmas Eve reckoning reminds us that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they refuse to accept injustice. Her legacy challenges us to consider what we're willing to sacrifice to protect those who can't protect themselves. For Martha Jane Canary herself, Christmas Eve 1878 was both her greatest triumph and her greatest burden. She'd saved countless lives by ending 5, restored hope to a desperate community, and proven that justice could prevail even in the most lawless circumstances. But she'd also crossed a line that forever changed how she saw herself and how the world saw her. The woman who'd begun 1878 as a frontier character known for drinking and cursing ended the year as a folk hero celebrated throughout the American West. The transition wasn't easy or comfortable, but it was necessary. Deadwood needed an angel of vengeance that Christmas Eve, and Martha Jane Canary answered the call. Today, more than 140 years later, the debate continues about whether Jane's actions were justified or excessive, heroic or criminal. But one fact remains undisputed. When 5 of the most dangerous men in the Dakota Territory decided to make war on innocents, they discovered that Deadwood had a guardian angel, one who was prepared to deliver justice with her own hands when no one else would act. The legend of Calamity Jane was born in gunsmoke and winter cold on Christmas Eve 1878, when a woman looked evil in the face and refused to blink first.